I would like to welcome everyone for joining us for Are You Ready to Garden, our series that we've been having each week on Thursday evenings at 6:30. Hopefully that's a good time for everybody. And if there are better times, we're going to have a survey at the end, and we have some great questions for you at the end to find out whether you like this series and you want us to continue it. So we want you to stay on to the very end. We're going to end right at an hour and a half and then do a survey at the end and provide some good resources for everyone. I would just like to welcome my good friend and colleague, Ray Samuelis, is joining me today as a co-host. And we're going to talk about growing the best Jersey tomatoes and peppers. This is something that we have been doing for many, many years of my life. I know Ray's been working with us for over 42 years in Extension. And I've been with Extension for a little over 30, and I've known Ray for 30. I've been fortunate enough to know Ray Samuelis. He's, like I said, a good friend, colleague, and very knowledgeable in all areas of plant science and vegetable production. So it's good to have him here with us today. I brought him out of retirement. It wasn't an easy thing to do. We had to convince him, hey, Ray, we need you back here. You got to share some of your expertise with us.
I'm glad to be here.
And first, I want to thank a few people that are helping us out. Our sponsors are Middlesex County freeholders, of course, Burlington County freeholders, and all of our freeholders across the state of New Jersey that support our county cooperative extension offices, because without their support, without the people's support throughout the state, cooperative extension and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station wouldn't be here to share information and do a lot of research that's pertinent to the state of New Jersey. I also want to thank Rutgers University and the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station for providing our support, so that working together with many of our colleagues at Rutgers, we're able to do a lot of programming and research that, like I said, directly benefits farmers, landscapers, consumers, and helps to solve problems in real time across the state of New Jersey. So without any further ado, I'm going to get this rolling today. I told you already a little bit about myself. I'm from Rutgers, 30 years at Rutgers. I teach a couple courses there, starting and managing a small farm, and also other courses like sustainable agriculture at Rutgers, and been family farming for about 35 years. And then I'm going to introduce Ray. Why don't you talk a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, I attended Delaware Valley College and then moved on to Cornell a number of years ago after working for a large farm cooperative in the Midwest for a number of years, which is now merged with Agway, called FS. And, I've always enjoyed agriculture. The other day, cleaning out one of my closets, I found a microscope that I had in a case, and it said on there, Professor Ray Samuelis. So I made that when I was 9 years old, and Professor of Agriculture. I knew what I wanted to do very early in my life, and it was agriculture has always been a passion and an extreme interest of mine due to its importance in our everyday lives. I also have hobbies, as Bill mentioned. I make beer and I make wine, in addition to my gardening, which is coming pretty well, even after the 8 nights of frost we had. So things are still going well. I did a lot of it on, off for a good number of nights there in a row. But they survived. They're blooming. They're doing well. So. Okay.
I'm glad to have you, Ray.
Thank you.
And here's a picture of Ray when he was younger. No, this is Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is one of the scientists that has done a lot of experimentation a long time ago with different crops and wasn't afraid to try new things. And he was an avid gardener. And one of his quotes is, "No occupation so delightful to me as a culture of the earth, no culture comparable to that of the garden." And as you probably know, he took copious notes, which is always a good thing when you're a gardener, especially when you're trying new things to see whether or not they're edible or poisonous, or there's something you like or dislike. But today we're going to talk about a lot of great tomato and pepper varieties and how to really get the most out of those plants that you do grow in your garden. Some of the things we'll be covering is planting the garden, selecting an area where you've got sunlight, plenty of sunlight, and you have the right type of soils. As you well know, the warm season crops like this, they just love the sun. So if you can give them 6 to 8 or even 10 hours of direct sunlight, they're going to produce more with the more sunlight they have. And you want adequate drained soils. So a lot of times we'll grow many of these crops on raised beds whenever possible, or you can grow them in pots to simulate the same conditions. Or just make sure that you have good drainage in the areas where you put these plants in. We're going to talk a lot about variety selection today, so I'm not going to discuss that now. We're going to talk about proper seeding in the greenhouse and in your basement, what kind of grow mixes to use. We're going to talk a lot about the different types of transplants, how to take care of them, watering, fertilization, when to harvest some of these guys, and then a little bit on storage and food preparation if we can get that far today. Keeping records is really important. Ray, do you know where this location is? You recognize?
I was going to ask you that, Bill. I don't.
Oh, it's Monticello.
Okay. I mean,
so it'd be a nice place to live.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a lot of protection there for plants, but that's Thomas Jefferson's old stomping grounds. And one of the things that, the reason I put that picture in is that Jefferson really kept excellent records of everything he did, planting to harvest to yields to whether or not he liked varieties. But there's also another reason to keep records so that you can rotate different plants from different families in different areas, and that rotation is really important to keep disease problems out so that we're working on fresh soil areas. You want to talk a little bit about choosing vegetable types and some of the lettering and codes that are on the different plants as you look at the seed packets, right?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I was going to say another important thing to keep records of is a detailed map of the garden, because I grow sometimes 12 or 15 varieties of tomatoes, and when you're planting them, you say, well, I know where that one is. I know this one is there, that one is there, and that lasts for about a week. And after that, was this one or was it that one? So keep a detailed map of the garden where each row is, where each plant is, and you can refer back to them to make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
So when we're choosing vegetable types, right on the seed packets many times, especially for peppers and tomatoes and some eggplant, you'll see different letter designations, and they just stand for resistance to verticillium or fusarium, N for nematodes, and T for tobacco mosaic virus. Also, you'll find out how many days to maturity, a little bit about the plant in terms of whether it was an All-America winner, is it a mid-season, early-season plant, is it a determinate variety versus indeterminate, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So if you're trying to produce plants quickly, then you're going to want something with a lower number of days to maturity. But you also kind of balance that out with looking for flavor, because some of the more flavorful varieties sometimes take a little bit longer to mature. Any comments on that, Ray?
Yeah, one of the things, that's important with vegetable gardening and why it's important to have these resistant varieties, as Bill mentioned, is the fact that most people don't have what we call rotational ground. When a farmer grows a crop, such as tomatoes, he's not going to plant that crop there probably for 3 to 5 years on the next schedule that he's using. But in my own garden, I use every square inch of it every year, don't have any rotational ground. So the way you can get around this partially, not fully, partially, is to use the resistant varieties. The other way you get around it, and Bill's going to talk a little bit about this, is when you raise vegetables in beds with artificial mix. The mix is sterile, and the rotational aspect of things becomes a little less important when you have artificial mix as opposed to indigenous soil that you use year after year after year.
And we're going to talk about growing things in pots as well, and that's another way to create yet a new planting area with new soil mix. so that you don't have to worry as much, because many of us don't have large gardens to rotate our crops, like Ray was saying. So the next best thing is to create planters that then we can put new soil in each year and go ahead and grow what we want to grow in those beds. And we're going to go over some of those in a minute here. So when we're looking at tomato flavor, as with peppers and anything that we look at flavor, there's a balance of certain volatile chemicals, certain organic acids, and certain amount of sugars. And the balance of all those things together is what goes into making a great tomato flavor. And really, tomato flavor is very subjective. Some people love certain varieties, and other people swear by, certain heirloom varieties or whatever. So you want to grow what you really like and what does well for you in your garden. And everybody's going to have different preferences, so that's why you want to try different varieties. And every year they always have a great tomato taste testing event up at the Snyder Research Farm up in Pittstown. And I don't know if they're going to be able to have it this year because of the situation, but if they do, we will make sure that we get information out to you, because it's really an event that you don't want to miss. It's a terrific event. You have almost every tomato variety under the sun up there, and it's usually in late August that they hold that event, mid to late August. So we'll let you know about that. Just make sure you sign up on our list so that we can get in touch with you when the time comes. And as Ray said, people are starting a vegetable garden. They have very limited space. So it's a matter of working with the space that you have, making sure you're adding enough organic matter, and you've taken soil tests so you know what your pH is, you know what your nutrient levels are. And if you're going to get a garden started and you're going to be planting tomatoes and peppers, you want to make sure that you work that ground possibly the season before if you've had turf in there, so that you don't have a grub problem in where you're going to put your tomatoes and peppers. And then you can put just a cover crop on top of it, which just means you could plant some perennial rye or annual rye on top of it, ryegrass even, and just it covers the top, and then just work it in the following season. And here you see in the bottom we have a compost sifter. So that's what I do with my compost. I put it through a sifter, put it in my wheelbarrow. I usually mix 2 or 3 inches of that in the top 6 to 8 inches of my garden. That way I can improve the organic matter, improve the drainage. I'll mix some of that in the season before if I have it, possibly with some manure that's been composted. And boy, does that make for a great vegetable garden the following season. And it gets a chance to continue to break down throughout the entire winter. And then you can put a cover crop right on top of that. And here's where Ray was talking about, pots that you can use. Here you have some large pots on the right. You can get very creative in terms of what types of pots you can use out there. You can build your own. You can use old buckets. There's a lot of things, and we're actually putting some fact sheets together of how you can create a 2-bucket self-watering system, and that fact sheet hopefully will be out very soon. This is what the fact sheet basically is going to show you, how to create just by recycling 2 old buckets and using a PVC pipe to water the bottom, and then cutting proper holes in the top bucket, and then creating a wick with another small pot in the middle. You can actually wick water up from the bottom, and if you're away for a few days on vacation, it's going to keep your tomatoes or your peppers moist while you're away. And then you just fill up the reservoir area, and then you can continue on, and then you can have an outlet, as you see here, so if it's too high, it'll be able to drain out so that you're not oversaturating your plants. Ray, have you ever built anything like this?
Yes. Well, not like this, but I'm a believer in something we call pyramid gardens. So we have herbal gardens at our house that have 5 different size clay pots, and just fill them up with a good quality mix, peat, perlite, vermiculite, good nutrients, stack them up, add each one a little smaller, and it makes a tiered system where we have basil, basil, dill, cilantro, 2 different kinds of parsley, and the list goes on. And you keep it right by your back door, so you don't even have to run out to the garden. You just run out the door, grab a few handfuls. Works out very well.
Ray, you need to put it a little further away so you get a little more exercise, right?
Yeah, right. Well, I have the big garden in the back, too. I have
pyramid gardening.
Yeah.
Is that illegal in certain states? I don't know. But anyway, well, I guess we'll find out. All right, so orientation of sun coming in. It's really important to know how much sun you're getting where you're putting your vegetable garden and the orientation of that so that you can put your taller plants in the back and then shorter plants that require that sun in the front. And we want to make sure that those plants are getting maximal sunlight, especially tomatoes and peppers, which we're focused on today. Like I said, 10 to 12 hours, even more, is great for tomatoes and peppers because they love the sun. We're going to talk about the origin of these plants, and they come from areas where they developed and evolved, where they get a lot of sunlight. So sunlight is extremely important, and if you don't have enough sun, it's going to cut back on your production of tomatoes and peppers. Some people are able to effectively grow them by supplementing the light or using reflective lights. Tomatoes are even grown in greenhouses, but some of the tomatoes that are adapted for greenhouse production are actually able to produce under a little bit lower light conditions, and we still can get anywhere from 10 to 15 or 20 pounds per plant, depending on the variety and how much nutrition that we give those plants.
As far as sunlight goes, too, Bill, like I have hedgerows around my gardens, which I planted, and I'm not really willing to cut them all down to get more sunlight. So I sacrifice some of my yield, but I'm willing to do that. The other issue you have where a garden is located sometimes, it's your neighbor's trees, and I have that situation too. Even if I cut all mine down, the neighbor's trees, certain times of the year and certain times of the day, also shade my garden. So there's not much I can do about that.
Right. It's not nice to cut your neighbor's trees down.
Yeah.
Try to avoid that. Yeah. So if you want to sneak in and cut your hedges down one day, just let me know.
Okay, you're on.
Is it you or Karen that won't cut them down?
Right.
Anyway, soil testing. Soil testing is really important for farmers and gardeners and anybody that's starting a garden, or if you want healthy plants. You really want to make sure that your soil is in the right zone for the plants that you're growing. And for most of our vegetable plants, they can do fairly well at a pH about 6.2 to 6.5, depending on the vegetable. But for peppers and tomatoes, that's pretty ideal. Even between 6 and 6.5, they will do quite well. And if you think you have a pH problem and you don't have time to test right away, or you just don't have a kit handy, one of the things you can do is add a little bit more organic matter in there. Add your peat moss or compost, because peat moss and compost helps to stabilize the pH in soils to make nutrients more available. But eventually you'll still want to get your soil tested to make sure that it's in the right area so that those plants can thrive. For tomatoes and peppers to really stay healthy, if they're in the right pH zone, it helps for those plants to be able to absorb the macro and micronutrients that they need. But then it also helps to stimulate beneficial microorganisms that are making the transformation and breakdown of other nutrients within that soil area where right around the rhizosphere. And you can see on the left here, it tells you the pH of different substances, so you kind of know that battery acid is like down below 1, lemon juice around 2, vinegar 3, beer and coffee around 4. No wonder I'm so acidic. Natural rain up around 5.5. Pure water is rated 7. Baking soda at 8. So you can kind of see, based on compounds that you're familiar with, where that pH needs to be. So slightly on the acid side is where most of these vegetable plants do quite well. Any comments, Ray?
Yeah, as far as soil testing, too, you have to understand what kind of information you can glean from soil tests. As Bill mentioned, you get pH, okay, which is very important, but you also get some other things out of it. You get your calcium levels, you get your magnesium levels, phosphorus, potassium, and other elements. Now, if your pH is up to an adequate level, generally speaking, your calcium and magnesium will be up to the proper level, because those materials consist of both calcium and magnesium carbonates, okay? Now, if you in South Jersey, the soil's the element that's going to be most likely lacking is the potash. And the reason being potash is highly soluble and does not build up in the soils from additional fertilizer applications. So that's a problem. The phosphorus, on the other hand, is the opposite. It will build up in your soils, and when we would do the soil test at the office, I would say 90% of them would come off high off the chart, high in phosphorus, even though the people didn't put that much phosphorus on them, because it just builds up over years. So that's important, you know, to know what
and phosphorus tends to bind to the soil colloids.
Right.
A little bit.
Another thing people sometimes would ask us, you know, and I used to joke at this, but this would happen every few months. Somebody would say, you know, I have a neighbor and they poisoned my garden. And I would sort of chuckle inside and laugh and say, boy, you must have nasty neighbors. 99% of chance that that isn't what happened. They killed their plants and they want to test the soil for pesticides or weed killer or whatever. You really can't do that. Theoretically, you can, but you have to know what chemical is in the soil, and then you're going to spend $500 for a test for one element. So practical means you can't test for other things too much other than your calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, boron, and a few others.
Thanks, Ray.
Nope.
Hey, Bill, I'd also like to mention about soil testing that the Rutgers Soil Lab has great video and instructions on how to test your soil.
Yes, they do. So we're going to put a link on here so that if you have any questions about testing your soil, you'll be able to go to our website that we'll post at the end. Dave will be posting that for you. And you can actually watch those videos, and it'll explain exactly how to test your soil. And the Soils Lab is open. You have to send your samples directly there, but it is open for you to use once again. So for starting seedlings, many of you have already started your seedlings, hopefully, and some people use the grow lights. We mentioned this before in one of our first classes. Just make sure that you use a warm and a cool fluorescent light, or some of the lights I'm going to show you in a minute here. Keep the light as close to the plants as possible without creating intensive heat for those. And if you add additional sources of light from the outside, you won't have spindly or etiolated plants because those plants will be getting adequate light. So soil temperature, we're going to go over that in just a minute, but lighting is extremely important for any plant if you want to keep it healthy. There are some LED lights like these T5 grow lights that are relatively new. They're very energy efficient. We're using these in certain greenhouses, and there's other types of lights that we use that are more expensive. If you want a light that provides a broad spectrum of light and relatively efficient with energy so that we're not spending too much money on the inputs for the light energy. So these are something that you can take a look at. The T5 lights are available if you need more light when you're starting your plants.
One thing, Bill, that I would add was that there's newer types than that, even the LED lights with colored filaments in them. And the lights that I use have, I think, about 200 little bulbs in them, and there's multi-colors to them. And there's switches on there where you can have it phased for vegetative growth, phased for flowering growth, or both of them together, depending on what kind of plants you're raising. So yeah, it's very sophisticated nowadays, right, the type of lights.
And actually, the wavelength of light does matter when you're starting plants, when you go from red to red to blue, when you're starting plants. So a lot of these new systems can do that. They will actually adjust depending on the stage of the plant that you're looking at. So this right here is one of the greenhouses that we use on our family farm. As double wall plastic on the top layers, and then we can roll the sides up to allow for air circulation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So when you go inside, you can actually see that we have fans, and we have the top portion of that opens up to allow for adequate air circulation, which is extremely important when growing any plants. And you can emulate that same thing by making sure that your plants or you could even put a fan down in the basement or where you're growing the plants because you want good air circulation. And you want the plants to move a little bit. You want them to dry out so that they don't get extra moisture on them for disease problems. But also it strengthens that young seedling when it's moving around all the time. So that's really important. And you got to make sure we don't overwater those plants. So we're very careful about how much water we add depending on the stage of the seedling. We want to keep the soil moist but not overly saturated so that we don't have damping off problems. And I'll show you a little bit of that as we get into this a little bit more. But you see here we've got a lot of air circulation going on through that house. And there's a lot of different materials you can use to start plants, like pro-mixes. They're made up primarily of peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite. And these are basically, they're called sterilized potting soils because they're pretty much devoid, or at least we hope they're devoid of any disease, or especially disease problems that could exist. That's why we don't use soils directly from gardens. We want to start our peppers and tomatoes in these sterilized potting mixes so that we're getting a fresh start. Once the plant is established, the plant becomes more resistant and resilient and is able to fight off some of those organisms that could cause problems early on. And it's a good idea to kind of test different mixes to see what kind of grow mix works for you. But you don't want to use those garden soils that you see in the store that are just called garden soils because they can contain other contaminants, which Ray and I used to unfortunately work with a little bit, meaning some biosolids, and we don't want those in our growing mixes. So you want to use sterilized potting soil. You can even cut down on some of your expenses by using compost or even using a little bit more peat moss in the mix, and you'll still be able to get those plants started. And there are materials like root guard that you can add. Root guard will actually protect those plants because it has 2 species of trichoderma in them, which are beneficial fungi, and they can help prevent damping off. So that'll get your tomatoes and peppers off to a really strong start with those. And those are the different compounds that we usually have, peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite, in most of our standard sterilized potting mixes.
Bill, just briefly, Dave was asking, do you have a whiteboard menu open? Some people are seeing something blocking some of the slides.
I do not.
Okay.
Ray, do you have a whiteboard open?
No.
Okay.
Bill, I had another comment, too, about the mixes, too. Within the last 2 or 3 years, they have a new product that's come out, and it's called Coir, C-O-I-R, and it's made out of coconut shells. And I tried it myself this year for the first time, and the results are mixed, and I had it side by side with the traditional mixes like you're talking about, and they did much, much better than the Coir. So I was hoping for better things. I'm not willing to totally write it off, but I'm willing. No, it's not leaps and bounds. It was sold from the standpoint that it's sterile, which they both are, and also about watering, that it would be harder to overwater the Coir than it would be to overwater the peat vermiculite. And I didn't really find that to be true, but pepper plants are much inferior where I use the Coir mix.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never tried that, but it sounds like I'm glad I did because it sounds like you had problems with it.
Yes.
One other thing that we've always had good luck with on our farms where we do have cows or we have sheep or goats is we'll sometimes take the manure, work it in the soil the season before, we'll put it and compost it, and you want to make sure that it's composted well before you use it in your garden. But there's a lot of different salts and minerals and compounds in manure that actually can stimulate and provide a lot of micronutrients to plants and also stimulate beneficial microorganisms within the soil. So if you can get a hold of well-composted cow manure, and you want it to say cow manure or have an origin on it so that you're not buying sewage sludge or those type of materials or biosolids is the name for them. You want to make sure you know the origin. And you want to put this down fresh when you're gardening that year. Put it down the season before, work it in, and then put a cover crop on top of it. And a lot of times, if you have sandy soils or you have low organic matter soils, a combination of compost and manures along with some of your good compost quality food compost, you can really boost that soil up, and you'll have a very productive season the following year.
One thing, Bill, about the compost too is you have to be careful what you buy at garden centers, particularly.
Yes, absolutely.
You'll go and they'll say it's finished compost. Well, here's a little test you can use to prove them right or wrong. Lift the bags up, stick your hand between the bags, and if it almost burns your hand, it's not finished compost. It's still composting, because one of the byproducts of making compost is a tremendous amount of heat. And if it's that hot, even, anyway hot, it's a compost in progress, is not a completed compost.
That's a good point, because another way you can tell it's going to have a smell to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you were working with a spray when we were doing the research on some of the products, the composting and some of the biosolid products, and they were still in the process of being broken down into humus.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The problem is when they're still breaking down and they're still active and you can still recognize the original ingredients, they will produce an ammonia smell.
Right.
So if you're using a product and you smell that strange ammonia smell in there, you want to leave it alone and don't use that, and look for something else.
When I was agent, I ended up in court 2 or 3 times because people would get something delivered and they would say it was topsoil and this, and it wasn't. One time particularly, the soil had, some compost mixed in, it had glass in it, it was a road macadam and all this, definitely was not.
Yeah, that's for another day. That would be a whole hour talking about soils and trying to replace soils, because I'll tell you, that's a difficult subject.
Tough.
Okay, so this is one area where we can actually apply compost over the lawns. We can apply it to our vegetable gardens, but we want to screen it first. And anything that's not broken down, we go ahead and put back in the compost bin to make sure it's composted. The one thing you don't want to do is add materials that haven't been broken down around the root systems of your tomatoes or peppers. Otherwise, it's going to steal the nitrogen from those plants. So you want to use finished compost. We got to get moving a little bit here. Okay, so in starting plants, you got to make sure you have all the right, make sure you're marking everything, make sure you have, a record of everything that you're planting and how much, and you're not over-fertilizing what you have. You want to read the packets to make sure you start your seeds at the right depth. And if you do that, and they're coming up within, 7 or 10 days, just like it says on the packet, then you've done the right thing, and you want to keep it moist, but not overly wet when you're seeding those plants. And you can see here that this is the way we do it commercially, where we'll actually just seed varieties in a row, and we'll get a lot of tomatoes going within a short space this way. And then we'll start our seeding about 4 to 6 weeks before we're getting ready to either set them in a high tunnel or set them out in the field. And, if we have a place that's going to be protective of those plants that I'll show you in a minute, then we can get a little bit earlier start. We try to get those mixes up in the beginning to at least 70 degrees. If we get them up to 75, that's even better. And then when we have the first true leaves develop, we can go ahead and move some of those out. When they get a little bit bigger than the ones you see here, we'll start to spot those out into individual containers, which you'll see here in a second. So this is a way of just seeding a lot of plants within a small area if you don't have a lot of space. And then you can take the individual seedlings and spot them out into these flats like you see here. And oftentimes we have to use seedling mats, and you can get these online from Grower Supply and many different places. And especially if you're growing peppers, and certain hot peppers are a little finicky. Mm-hmm. So what we'll do is we'll use these heating mats, and there are settings right on it. You can actually see, if you look closer on the one slide, it actually has different settings for different types of plants. So for peppers and tomatoes, it's about the same. Peppers probably a little bit warmer than tomatoes. And when you set it there, you're going to see that warmth coming from underneath, and it's going to get those plants off to a good start early on so that they'll germinate faster and we'll have less problems. And The area to the right is a commercial heat mat that we use for large numbers of plants. And we got to keep an eye on that to make sure it doesn't get too hot so that it stresses those plants out and they dry out too fast. What we'll sometimes do with peppers as well is we'll actually put a wet newspaper over the top of them just in the beginning, just to keep them moist. And then as they start to come up, then we'll take that newspaper off. And the idea there is just to conserve moisture, to keep that moisture right at the surface along with it, and it locks that heat in. And that'll speed up our germination process for both tomatoes and peppers. Ray, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I don't know. Can you see what I'm holding up here?
Magnifying glass.
No. This is one of my seedlings I use. One alternative to sowing seeds thick and then respotting them is using.
Oh, okay. I see it now.
And it has 5 or 6 different hole sizes.
Oh, yep.
Put it in there, and you can singulate the seeds one at a time. I even did basil, which was sort of like poppy seeds, so it was very, very fun. And I could still get them pretty thinned out. You can save money on seed, particularly with expensive hybrids, and then you don't have to transplant them the second time. You can just thin them out. I just pulled a couple plants out, but works very well.
I have to say, Ray, I got one of those this year to use in my garden. It's a couple $1 piece of plastic, and it's a great investment. It's one of the best things I've ever bought.
Is about it. Yeah, it was good.
So here's we've got some seedlings coming up, and they're looking very healthy. You don't need to add a lot of fertilizer in the beginning. Usually we just use a complete fertilizer mix, very low rates in the beginning. The idea is just to get them up, get them started, make sure they got as much light as we can possibly get to them so that we have nice, healthy seedlings. And we want to water them lightly. You really got to be careful not to overwater young seedlings of tomatoes and peppers. Some people in the organic field will use fish emulsion or other fertilizers. Sometimes those are a little bit slow to break down, so you may have to use some other more soluble organic materials if you want a quick release of fertilizer, but you want to make sure you don't overdo it. Slow release fertilizer and being cautious with the amount of fertilizer is very important. Here you see where we've taken these plants and we spotted them out to these trays on the right, and you can see that all of our benches have really good drainage so that we've got good airflow. We've got good water flow through all those pots. And then when we spot them into individual containers, they got plenty of space to grow. So we keep them in those containers for quite a while until we're getting ready to put them out in the field in these 3-inch pots, and they do extremely well. Once again, air circulation. Make sure throughout that whole time that we've got the fans on. We're going to show you how to do a little homemade greenhouse at home, but it's a good idea to make sure that you can open up the vents within any place where you're growing that to make sure that the air circulation is adequate for plants. Some people will like to use low tunnels, and I know we talked a little bit about that when Brendan was talking before. There's a lot of very cheap versions of low tunnels using PVC or using bent steel, as Brendan had shown. So if you want to go back to that episode, it's on our website at the end where you can actually see Brendan building and bending those hoops. The problem with PVC is it breaks down in the sunlight. It doesn't have a lot of integrity, so if the wind blows too strong, it's going to crack and break. But for a temporary garden, it's a quick and easy fix for some people, and then you can put row cover on top of it to protect the plants and also keep some pests out, or you can put some plastic over the top of it. But a lot of times it requires more bracing, so it's a little tricky to use this. And then some people get creative and they'll put greenhouses right next to their home and actually use the heat from the basement, where they'll blow the heat in from the basement and just create a little greenhouse. I thought this was pretty creative that this person had used their home and then just used the heat from their basement to keep their plants healthy until they got them out into the other parts of the garden. So there's a way where he didn't provide, the only additional heat that he's providing is actually from the basement of his house. And he just built a PVC door, and then he also used PVC for the sides and then just draped one sheet of plastic over that. So you can be quite creative and try to start your tomato and pepper plants. And then there's a lot of different ways to work the soil. You could use shovels and spades, or if you want to go up a couple notches, you can get a good BCS tiller like this one that does a great job. This is one of the ones we use on small farms and gardens. And they just do a good job of working in your compost and working up the soil. And then if we need to add fertilizer or lime to adjust the pH, we can do that at that time. We actually have a video that talks about how to use these properly, that's available on our website as well. But you don't need big equipment to get started. You can even just use a shovel and double turn your garden. So we can use different mulches to protect plants as well. I was just out yesterday with one of our farmers, Jim Maurice, and he was using the red plastic for some of the tomatoes that he put out. And, you know, in some research, it indicates they get anywhere from a 10 to 20% increase in yield with certain tomato varieties if they use red mulches, and some farmers like it. You could try it and see if it works for you. The conventional plastic that we use is a black plastic, or we'll use different types of organic mulch like straw. And what we'll do is we'll run irrigation underneath of that, what's called a drip line, and we can actually water those plants underneath. In some areas, people will actually use landscape fabric and then just cut within the landscape fabric, use a utility knife, cut into that, and then just plant their plants there, and that helps to keep the weeds down in those areas as well. The black plastic is nice because it heats up the soil, it keeps weeds down so that you don't have so much weeding out in your garden. The red plastic will do the same thing, but the red plastic is reflecting that red wavelength of light, which is suspected with certain varieties will actually increase the yield. And in an open area, you can either do it by hand, or I'll show you in a minute how we do it commercially, but you can lay plastic out in the field and then pop your plants in. Hey, Brendan, do you want to talk about this? I know you used this last year for your flowers.
Yeah, I use this for cut flowers. You can lay out a long row like that. Putting your drip tape down underneath is definitely helpful first. If you're planting something that has a kind of closer spacing, you can use templates that have your holes already in a pattern, and then you can burn the holes in using a blowtorch to just repeat that pattern over and over again. But for something like tomatoes, you don't need to get too crazy with that.
You had a blowtorch. I'd definitely be out using one of those. So it sounds like fun.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know you had one last year that you were using that worked pretty well. We also have a little puncher that we used to use when we first started with plastics. It would just go...
Anytime you can incorporate fire into your gardening is always going to be a good time.
Oh, yeah. Fire is good. So plastic, as you see here, you're burying both edges of it. And basically, that's going to keep that plastic in place so the wind doesn't blow it away. The one thing they didn't do, as Brendan had mentioned, they didn't lay their twin wall or drip irrigation down ahead of time, which they should have done, because wherever you have solid plastic, you have to have some way to get the moisture down into those where the plants are going to be. So this is what we do commercially. We use plastic layers. Typically, we'll have one person at the end of that field holding the plastic and holding the drip irrigation line. We usually tie that to a stake or just hold on to it. And then the plant will actually dig on the sides. We'll dig a trench, the plastic will go down, and then it fills in on the sides, as you can see on the bottom, and it actually produces a nice growing bed for the plants. And then in between, we could use some kind of mulch or other material to prevent the weeds from coming in. But it's a good way to prevent weeds, to capture moisture, and keep those plants healthy. So what our objective is really is we want stocky green plants of peppers and tomatoes, free of pests and diseases. We want to make sure that when we're taking those plants out of the pots that we started them in, we're very careful to remove those so that we don't break the plants. And these plants are really nice because they're good and thick transplants. You can see they've got a really good root system on them. And we kind of turn the pot upside down, hold it, support it with our hand, and then kind of coax it out. Just squeeze the sides a little bit, and then loosen up the outer roots just a little bit before we put them in the ground. Tomatoes you can plant a little bit deeper. With peppers, you want to plant them at about the same depth they are in the container. But tomatoes, that whole area that you see that's kind of grayish blue all the way up to that first major leaf, and even a little bit beyond that, we can go ahead and plant tomatoes deeper, and they will do fine. They will produce adventitious roots all the way up. So then we want to water those plants in, make sure we've got at least 2.5 feet between those plants for spacing, and then we can stake those if we so desire. We want to protect things by frost. If we're having a frost and cold nights coming in, if it's starting to get into the low 50s and into the 40s, tomato plants can withstand a little bit more cold than peppers can. Peppers are a little more sensitive, and so are eggplants. But tomatoes, if it's going to get real cold, like down into the 30s, and you might want to just cover those plants up if they started to adjust it to warm temperature. You could just put a bucket over those plants, use one of these hot caps. You just want to make sure you remove it the next day when the temperatures increase so you don't end up burning those plants. And I like to use stakes, and I like to use cages, because cages are great. Do you use these, Ray, in your garden?
No, I use use buckets. I just
okay. Cool. Now that works too. Buckets are great because most tomatoes and peppers you can grow in a 5-gallon bucket.
Yep.
So the way this system works here, they've used cattle wire, which has large openings. It's galvanized. You can reach in easily. They put plastic around it when it gets cold, and it keeps the wind off so that the plants don't desiccate if it's real cold and windy outside. Then they can remove the plastic when it starts to heat up. And there are 2 basic types of tomatoes out there. The determinate, which are more of a bush type, where they get to a certain point and they really start to push out the majority of growth. They will still continue to produce tomatoes, but it's within a shorter range of time, and it's usually a more compact plant. Whereas the indeterminate varieties keep growing and growing. They keep climbing, and many of the heirloom tomatoes are like this. I know when one of our colleagues was doing an heirloom tomato trial, first he put in 8-foot stakes, and then he put in 10-foot stakes. And then he went back and even the longest stakes he could possibly use, and then he realized that he was going to have to start pruning those tomatoes back quite a bit. Any comments on that, Ray? Anything that you've had success with, or Brendan?
I use 6-foot stakes for mine. So. And, with good pruned, they'll grow to the top and start falling over. But
and how do you usually prune your tomatoes?
Take all the suckers out. I just did it today and yesterday, actually. Took all the suckers out for 2 or 3 times, and then end up, with like 2 branches that'll become, the tall stalks. So.
Hey, do we have any questions from anybody? Angela or Brendan, do you see any questions coming in?
There's lots of questions. I guess I want to go back to one. Kathleen was talking about, or was asking whether you want to clip the first flowers that come off the peppers early in the season to promote flowering later in the season.
Clip the first flowers?
Right, that's what she was asking.
We don't do that in our production system. I don't think that that's a good idea. If the temperature, typically it's not necessarily going to encourage it. What they sometimes will do is, and you can look this up online, or we could put it on our website, is when you're first starting the seedlings, you can actually keep them a little bit on the cooler side after they've developed their third true leaf for 2 weeks. And what that will do is that seedling will then be shocked, especially with peppers, into producing a better set of flowers. So look that up and I can put something online about that, because that's what we do, but I have to put something online so that you guys can understand how to do it and increase your yield a little bit with peppers.
I think where that concern comes about is commercially, even farmers will do this. If they want to get ultra early yields, they'll put tomato plants out with little tomatoes on them. Now, that comes at a big price. You'll get the early tomatoes, but your yield will probably be a third or 40% of what it would be if you didn't do that. So.
Right. Now with tomatoes, it's different. If you see a tomato growing on the plant, we'll actually pull the little tomatoes off when we set them out.
Right.
Because that's a different story. You don't want those tomatoes are actually going to take away from that plant establishment, because the first thing you want that plant to do when you're setting it out in the field, it's in a little bit what we call transplant shock. So by removing that little tiny tomato, if it's on there before you even set it out in the field, that plant will be able to recover quickly and return its energy back into producing the next and following sets of tomatoes. So that's really what you want to do to increase production. So tips for early tomatoes, because many of you want early tomatoes. You want to plant a variety that's a shorter season, that's going to be determinate, that's not quite as large, because many of the large, like Beefmaster and all of those, they're going to take quite a few days, 80 or 90 days or more to mature. You want to protect the plants from frost, make sure you're starting off with healthy plants. And then by warming those soils up with black plastic or mulch that's going to warm up, you're going to get earlier tomatoes. People think that just because the plant is outside that it's going to automatically just start growing. Well, if the soils are cold, then many of these solanaceous type plants just sit there until the soil really starts to warm up. Mm-hmm. Because when the soil warms up, then the root system starts to expand, the microorganisms and the rhizosphere just starts to really respond to those warm temperatures. So that's why we use those black plastics in the fall to really warm up those areas. Fertilization, we want to be careful not to add too much. If in the absence of a soil test, you can use about 2 to 4 pounds of a 5-10-5 per 100 square feet. Or 3 to 5 pounds of limestone every 2 to 3 years per 100 square foot, but you really want to test that soil. It's a good idea to test it so you know exactly how much, if you even need lime, and you want to bring that pH up to about 6 to 6.5. And you can use organic or conventional type fertilizers, depending on what you want to do. And then hardening off transplants is extremely important, that you make sure that those transplants don't go directly from the basement out into your yard without gradually exposing them to just a little bit more light. Now, you can do it, of course. People do it all the time, and the plants recover. But if you can gradually expose the plant to more wind and direct light over a period of a week or more, then what will happen is those plants will be more likely to bounce back and be much stronger and healthier, and they'll give you better tomatoes and better peppers. Okay, let's get into
to that, Bill, too, and that is dropping the temperature, dropping it down 5 or 10 degrees to help burn them off, too.
You're absolutely right. You can actually, commercially, what we do is instead of carrying them all outside, we actually cut back on the watering, because we can't carry 10,000 plants outside.
Yeah, right.
But we can cut back on the watering, and it does harden them off. But you have to know what you're doing, because you have to do it to a certain level. So with tomatoes, the controversy is over. Tomatoes are a fruit, as you can see here. And the idea is to keep that flower healthy in the beginning stages. So when it gets too hot at night, or if it gets too cold, we can lose those flowers. We can have flower abortion on those plants. And that's sometimes when people say to me, oh, we didn't get any early production. Well, it could have been simply that that flower was exposed to extreme low temperatures or extreme high temperatures, and therefore the flower aborted. Usually, if it starts to climb in the early stages of fruit development, even if that temperature starts to climb over 75 or 80, with certain varieties, we can start to see flower abortion, which can be a real problem. Health facts for tomatoes. We all know that tomatoes are good for us. Many people don't realize all the good macro and micronutrients that are in them, and all the lycopenes, which is actually, there's many different articles out there now talking about the benefits. And later in this series, I actually have several people on that are going to be talking about preservation of tomatoes and peppers and pickling and canning. So you're going to want to tune in, and they're going to talk more about the nutrition, so we won't spend much time on it now. So these just gives you an idea what different tomatoes and how they're used in different settings. Like we usually use Roma, heirlooms, and tomatoes on the vine for sauces. We want to use the low water content when we're making sauces as much as possible. And I know Ray's going to give us a little bit of information here in a moment on canning. For salads, the grape and cherry tomatoes and even cut up, large slicing tomatoes are great for salad, especially when you get into some of the, we're going to give you some really good varieties of both tomatoes and peppers to grow today. So that's why I'm trying to speed up a little bit. And then cherry tomatoes are used when we put those on a skewer. I love the good old beefsteak tomatoes and the slicing tomatoes. And some of my favorites in a minute here. For frying, fried green tomatoes are really good. And then for snacks, just to throw them right in your lunchbox, you can use the grape or cherry or some of the small heirlooms that we're going to be showing you. Canning, right? Tell us about the canning part of this.
Starting, I guess, 2 years ago, I sort of thought a lot about the process and thought about what flavors develop when you make homemade sauce. And I came to the conclusion that when you make homemade sauce out of heirlooms and fresh tomatoes and, such, and you boil them down to take off half the volume of water, it changes the flavor, and it really ruins a lot of the flavor. So I sort of came up with this idea and did a little research on it. And basically what I do now is I put them in the oven, cut them in half for, I forget the temperature, maybe 350 for 20 minutes. The skins peel right off, and a lot of the water runs out of the tomatoes. So then afterwards, you put them in with a little hand blender, blend them up a little bit, and then process them the same way. You end up with a sauce that tastes much, much more like fresh tomatoes and heirloom tomatoes than you do a standard canned tomato, which has been cooked to death. So I'm very happy with this system. And again, they're still processed, with heat and all that, so the safety is there, and there's still, citric acid is still added to them to change the pH of the mix to make sure nothing weird grows in them like that. And
Ray, you and I are going to have to put some of our recipes on the website too, because my mother has she made an outstanding tomato gravy. That's what she used to call it.
Yep.
And so I'll put that on there for people to learn how to make that.
So it's different ways of doing it, So.
Yep. So the origin of the tomato, it's tomatoes from the west coast of South America. And a lot of scientists still arguing over the actual origin of the tomato. But the interesting thing about tomatoes, the more that I've read about them over the years, is that there's some pretty tough wild tomato relative varieties that survive in extreme conditions. So they've gone back to try to re-isolate many of these species and the genetics on them, because one of the original ones, Lycopersicon pimpinellifolium, actually has a lot of disease resistance built in, and they're using some of those genes and hopefully preserving those because it has resistance to verticillium and fusarium and many of the problems that we encounter. But even more importantly, some of these original varieties of the tomatoes, which are the size of a pea, actually have the abilities to survive under really tough conditions. If you get out of Mexico, some of these varieties are growing between rocks under extreme heat conditions in areas where it's extremely droughty. So there's many different varieties down there. So it's become more challenging, though, to go in and actually get varieties like that and try to preserve them than it once was. But there's a lot of genetics out there that we do need to save. And there's a genetic depository at the university. California Davis has a very good repository from Dr. Rick out there. And some of the original tomatoes, as you can see on the left, some of the origins of tomatoes are tiny little pea-shaped plants. They do taste like tomatoes, supposedly, from the scientists. I've never tried some of these. And you can see over the years they evolved through all the way up into the Mexican region, where they were breeding these tomatoes until we have the modern tomato, which was shared with even the Aztecs, and the Aztecs shared them with the Spaniards, and then they came over into Europe. They brought the tomato with them, and many people back in the day would eat tomatoes because they thought they were poisonous. They used to call them, they used to have different names for them. One was love apple, but Many people for a long time did not eat tomatoes. And you know why that was, Ray?
Yeah, just they believed two things. One of which was that it caused appendicitis, which
Right.
I'm not sure where that came from. And the other one was that the skins, after they peeled off in your stomach, would cement themselves some way to the lining of your stomach and hurt you. And in fact, when I did a little bit of research on this, I believe Thomas Jefferson was in that train of thought. And we're talking the late 1780s up to 1820. And then there was sort of a seminal event that occurred, and actually for the whole country of the U.S., and it occurred in New Jersey in Salem County. Colonel Johnson, in September of 1820, had a big exhibition on the steps of the Salem courthouse, and hundreds of people gathered around because they thought he was going to die, after he ate this tomato. He ate the tomato, and of course he didn't die, and the rest is history, and that's how the tomatoes became popular in the U.S.
Well, there was also some other things that happened. The well-to-do used to have pewter dishes. And
right.
the problem with pewter, of course, is that it has lead in it, and tomatoes are acidic. So some people would actually just use their pewter and ended up getting lead poisoning. A lot of acidic tomatoes. Whereas people that didn't have that were fine when they ate the tomatoes. So a little bit of
local history.
A little bit of time and a little bit of testing, they figured out what the problem was. So all of these plants, tomatoes, are in the family Solanaceae: tomato, pepper, potato, eggplant. And many people don't think of these all being in the same family. So when you grow these plants year after year, that's why, as Ray said earlier, you want to make sure that you clearly mark what you're growing in the garden and where you're growing it, because anything within this family, you don't want to plant the same plants from the same family in the same location year after year. So, down where these tomato plants originated, they're perennials in the warmer regions of the world, but in our area, of course, they're simply annuals. So when we select tomato varieties, we're selecting them for flavor. We're selecting them for, adapted to our site and for disease resistance within our area, but mostly for flavor and kind of secondary for yield if you're growing them in your garden. We grow different varieties in our high tunnels and greenhouses because we grow varieties that can withstand a little bit less light, are more function or focused in growth, like the determinate varieties. And you can produce some very beautiful greenhouses in high tunnels and in greenhouses, but there are specific varieties that you should use and you'll have more success with it. One of the varieties that was developed back a long time ago, when tomatoes were really starting to come into focus in 1934, was for Campbell soup, was the Rutgers tomato. Still grown by many people. It takes between 70 and 80 days for maturity for that tomato. Still a good tasting tomato, and we still have it every year, Ag Field Day up at Rutgers, and many people come for the plant. It was one of the first plants we had that had some fusarium resistance in it. Indeterminate plant, tends to keep growing. And it's a good plant. Not my favorite tomato overall, but it's a pretty good, stable tomato for many people. Each person has their own favorites, but we now have the Rutgers 250, which is even better, and Dr. Orton has developed that over the years, the past 3 years, and the 250 is an excellent tomato. So if you haven't had a chance to try the Rutgers 250, give it a try. And then if you have containers, like many of us don't have a lot of space for tomatoes, the Bush Goliath is one to try. In as little as 65 to 68 days, you'll start to see tomatoes. Smaller fruit, and as I said before, you're going to have more. If you're going to grow in containers, you're going to have tomatoes that are going to be small, bushy. It's going to take less days for those to form fully ripe fruit. So they're going to be ideals for containers, and you want to make sure that you're growing them in a container that has good drainage. The nice thing about the Bush Goliath, too, is it's resistant to nematodes, verticillium, and fusarium wilt. Have you ever tried that one, Ray?
No, I tried not the Bush Goliath, but the regular Goliath.
How did you like it?
Yeah, it was good. Good, a little bit soft and a little bit of cracking. But...
And early girl is one that I tend to grow every year. I like it because in very little time I can get tomatoes on there. They're good-looking tomatoes and good slicing tomatoes. So that's one of the popular ones that we've, a lot of our marketers and direct marketers will have early in the season, and many gardeners love early grow. Because in as little as 50 days, you're going to get smaller 5-ounce tomatoes, but they're quite good.
Yeah.
These plants on the left here are looking a little nitrogen deficient, just so you know. When they're yellow like that, that means they need a boost of nitrogen. Here's one of my favorites. There's even a newer variety of Celebrity, new and improved, but one of the best tomatoes that probably has come out in a long time. In as little as 70 days, you get an 8-ounce fruit. It's just a great plant overall. It's got good disease resistance. I don't see a lot of cracking on it. Produces a lot of tomatoes on each plant. And I grow these inside a cage, do a little bit of pruning at the bottom, but then I just let it grow and I get very good production. And that's the key. If you keep these plants upright off the ground, you're going to get better production and less disease problems from rotting. Is that one of your favorites, Ray? Celebrity?
Yes, it is. And also, I don't think you had it on the list when I looked through the slides earlier, but any of the mountain series.
Oh, yes.
Mountain
series are very good, yes.
They were developed by Dr. Randy Gardner, who was my office mate at Cornell, so I know him very well, and they're top-notch tomatoes.
Yeah, they are very good. Any of the mountain series, if you look for those, and Randy Gardner, excellent tomato breeder.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to keep an eye out for those. Ramapo was another tomato that was developed by Rutgers. At one time, it was a favorite of many farmers and many gardeners. Still a great tomato. The yields are good. Very good flavor. I like the nice balance of sugar and acids on the Ramapo. So it's a good tomato to try. It's not an heirloom. It's a hybrid. It has good disease resistance, and it's something that's offered and was developed right at Rutgers.
It's pretty late, though, isn't it, Bill, I think?
It is a little bit on the late side, yes. It's mid to late season is what it is. And then Mortgage Lifter, I don't know if you've tried this one, Ray, but it's one of my favorite of the heirlooms. Mm-hmm. It has a really good flavor, has good yield, a lot less cracking than many of the other heirlooms that you see out there. And I want to put a plug in for Pete Nietzsche, too, because these really nice slides are from him. Yeah. Pete always takes really good slides, so I got to give him credit for that. And you get orange to red ripe fruit. Some of the highest yields of the heirlooms, and they did the taste test at 2 locations in the state. They were getting some of the best ratings from Mortgage Lifter overall, that many people just thought it was a great tasting tomato. Yellow Stuffer is another good one, too. Have you ever tried this one, Ray?
No, I haven't had that one.
So the inside of this is hollow. So you can actually stuff it with whatever you want to stuff it with. Squirrel or, tuna fish or whatever you have handy over there in your neck of the woods. But the nice thing about it is that it also has good flavor on the outside. So the outer portion of the tomato actually tastes quite good.
Generally, yellow varieties are very sweet, whether it's...
They tend to be, yes.
Yeah, more so. And
there's something with the gene... I was reading that on one of the research articles. It was talking about the connection with certain genetic traits with color and with sweetness as well. Garden peach is kind of interesting one. Some people like it because it's mild. It doesn't have that bitterness or the acid. It has more sweetness to it. But I like the acid along with the sweetness. So this is not my favorite tomato, but some people that can't stand a lot of acid really like this tomato a lot. It has a little bit of a tiny bit of citrusy flavor to it. Some people say that it does. I really haven't tasted it in there. I just think it's a little bit more bland than some of the other tomatoes, but some people really like it. And it tends to produce, it's a good producer, and high marketability, so a good tomato. and it actually has a fuzzy appearance on the outside. So it actually looks, it's a tomato, but it looks a little bit like a peach. Anybody here tried that? No? Brandywine. Brandywine's a favorite of a lot of people. There are different strains. The one that we typically grow is a Sudeth Quisenberry strain. It takes a lot of days to grow these guys. They're pretty big tomatoes, but they're great tomatoes. They get great flavor. A little bit of cracking problems, of course. Any tomato, many of the heirlooms, we see more cracking and more misshapen fruit. When they started to breed tomatoes and really got into producing production tomatoes for harvesters as well, you see the tomatoes become more uniform in size and less cracking occur overall. But it does have great flavor. The one thing to do, if you're going to grow heirlooms, you really have to have fresh soil. You want to make sure that the heirlooms do not have weed competition. You want to warm that soil up. I would put heirlooms out just a little bit later than some of the other tomatoes because of their sensitivity to the cold. So if you want to grow a great heirloom, make sure you're taking extra special care, preventing weeds, warming up the soil. Do not over-fertilize it, because if you over-fertilize it, you're going to get even more cracking. What happens, sugars in the fruit, when the rain hits the outer portions of the fruit, if there's even small cracks or entryways, that water will be absorbed quickly, and then you'll see cracks occur because of the osmotic pressure differences in the fruit. Do you like Brandywine? Ray or Brandon, do you guys grow these?
I don't particularly care for it myself.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
I'm actually growing them this year, and it actually was really interesting to compare the leaves on them to my other tomato plants, because they really do have a much different leaf structure. They almost look like a different plant.
They're more of a potato leaf.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they look like potatoes. So you put in some potatoes out there, Brendan. You can actually compare the leaves of those. It's all in the same family. Aunt Ruby's German green. Now, I don't know if you guys have read anything on this, but some people claim it's the greatest tomato in the world. But I'll tell you, I've grown it a couple years in a row, and I think I would give mine back to Aunt Ruby because I don't think I'm going to grow it anymore. By the time you get a tomato after 80 days, it has so much cracking on it, and even with your best efforts, sometimes it's hard to get those tomatoes to produce a nice tomato. Now, maybe some people have good luck with it in their particular situation, but I've had better luck with other tomatoes. So I don't know that I would really recommend it for my garden or gardens around us here. And it's such a long season tomato. But if you guys do grow it and you have good luck with it, send me a note, let me know. There's some new varieties that are out, or relatively new. AAS winners, All-America selections. They have late blight resistance, like this tomato Galahad. Very high yielder, mid-sized fruit. And from what I have read on it, it's got a great meaty flavor. It's good for sandwiches, very highly crack resistant. And it's just as productive as can be. So it might be one that you want to try. It's out there. It's 75 days, produces 12-ounce fruit. So
this one I am growing this year, and
oh, you are?
I have to drop a box off for you to try it out.
Great. I hope it looks just like that.
Yeah.
When you drop it off. So I'm getting hungry for a tomato sandwich. Mm-hmm. I live on tomato sandwiches, Ray.
Yes.
I'll tell you, tomato sandwiches and Jersey sweet corn. Mm. We actually have some slides at the end to show you where you can get fresh produce all throughout the state of New Jersey, because you want to buy your produce directly. Whatever you can't produce in your garden, buy it from the local farmers, because they do a good job. Sun Gold, one of my favorites. Over the years of all of the cherry tomatoes, these little tiny 1-inch to 1.5-inch fruits are just some of the best tasting tomatoes that are out there. These actually went from the garden world into the commercial world, because I see more and more farmers actually starting to grow Sun Gold. In little as 60 to 65 days, you'll actually have fruit on these guys. And you want to make sure you support them, because you'll get a lot of tomatoes off of them that you can share with everybody in the neighborhood. It is one of the most popular varieties of cherries now. It ripens to that nice golden orangey color that you see there. They stay nice and firm. And if you keep them harvested on a regular basis, you're going to get a lot of tomatoes off of Sun Gold. So if there's one cherry that you want to grow, that's definitely the one.
Bill, I have those in my garden for my 6 grandchildren, you know.
Yeah.
I tell them, taste them. They're like candy.
I know.
Go try the candy tomatoes, kids, you know.
There's another one, too, you want to try called Ice's Candy. I don't have it in this list, but that one is extremely sweet. We've had it in our taste test. So it's Ice's Candy. This one approaches it. This one is extremely sweet. It's a new 2020 All-America selection. The Brix is very high on it, 8.5. So the higher that Brix value means the higher sugar value, because we test that for our strawberry breeding work that we do. Lightly acidic, has a good sugar acid balance. So this is definitely one you want to try. And I believe it's pronounced tomato croquini. They say pronounce the croquini. It's F1 hybrid. Abundant fruits. This thing produces, it has probably some of the best yields of any of these cherry tomatoes that are out there. So it's a very compact plant. You could actually grow this within a container, but you would still want to support it within that container. And then a real interesting one that it's out there is an apple. It's called Apple Yellow F1. It's an All-America selection for this year. It's an apple-shaped tomato, and it has a really interesting kind of citrusy taste to it. I haven't tasted it yet, but I do want to grow it. It has a meaty texture and a citrusy taste. And it looks interesting, so I've got to try it, if nothing else, just to see how it grows in my garden. Supposedly, it doesn't split. It's got pretty uniform shape, and it does look like a little yellow apple, so that's hence the name. Here's another good one. Another winner for last year was pepper just sweet F1, 65 days, 2 ounce fruit, and great for snacks. This thing is just unbelievable in terms of the production. Very vigorous plant. But they don't need to be staked because it's more of a bush type plant. And this pepper in a lot of the taste tests out there was one of the better tasting peppers. I'm going to show you another one that's one of my favorites too in a minute here, but one of the very best that you might want to give a try to. We mixed our peppers in with our tomatoes. Super sweet. Super Sweet 100. Ray, why don't you tell us a little bit about Super Sweet? I know you've grown that one.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very flavorful fruit with good acidity to it, and you know, very prolific, has good high yields.
So it's it's an easy plant to grow, even if you don't have a green thumb. Probably Super Sweet 100 is one of those tomatoes that grows very easily. It doesn't require a lot of individual care. As long as you either stake it or you got it in a cage, it's going to grow like crazy. Burpee Big Boy is another one. This is a shot from our greenhouse. Produces nice sized tomatoes, very disease resistant, a great plant overall. And then if you're producing paste, now I know this is your wheelhouse, Ray, because you're the paste production engineer here. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of these paste tomatoes?
Sure. Well, I think if, you know, historically you look at paste tomatoes, you think of the San Marzanos, the little small ones, you know, things like you see in this picture here. They're good and they're flavorful, not very disease resistant, you know. 2 years ago, I had an opportunity, one of my good friends and coworkers, in addition to veg crop, to work with cranberries and blueberries, Mark Ellenfeld, doctor, he's the USDA breeder for blueberries. He and I went to Burpee's farm to look at the research plots, and look at the new stuff that was coming out. It wasn't even released yet. I discovered when I was there one variety of tomatoes, which I have growing this year. They've been out there for 2 or 3 weeks already now, and it's called Super Sauce. Now, it sounds a little bit too good to be true, but I'm going to find out if it is or it isn't, and I'll be able to make a decision. The claim to fame is the individual fruits are between 2 and 2.5 pounds each, and it takes one fruit, one tomato, to make a pint of sauce. And I saw those tomatoes, and they were quite large. I didn't weigh them. I didn't see, able to determine exactly how big, but my garden is like a research trial. I have every variety, the size of them, the number of fruit I harvest, so I'll have all kinds of good data. So that variety is one. Secondly, there's one called Big Mama, which is another paste-type tomato, but that's probably 8 to 10 ounces a piece. So the one is like 8 times bigger than standard, and the other one's 4 or 5 times.
And that's unusual for a paste tomato to be that big.
Big, oh, absolutely, it is.
Yeah.
And then there's Grandero too, which is another one that I have. I have 4 or 5 different paste tomatoes this year that I'm looking at. So I have high hopes for it. And again, if it's anywhere near what they're saying it should be like, it should be pretty good.
Ray, if you could comment on the canning industry, because 80% of the tomatoes grown in the world.
Yeah, there's more canning.
Look at and there are different types of tomatoes, and right now we used to be the leader in the United States, but I believe China is now producing the greatest number.
Probably more, yeah.
Just to give you a heads up, we're about 5 of 8.
Okay.
Yeah, the evolution of the industry started in New Jersey and Maryland, evolved into Ohio, evolved into California, where it is now. But so the tomato industry, they're usually low value compared to fresh market tomatoes. Years ago, I remember working with actually some of your neighbors in Chesterfield Township, Bill. The time they were getting $50 a ton for processing tomatoes, whereas a good early season variety, 20-pound box, nowadays will do more than $50. So the farmers lost interest because the money and the economics were not there. So they moved on to the fresh market varieties.
So here's another good one. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker. Resilience. Here's another rounded Roma tomato, which is an abundant producer, has really good resistance to a lot of problems. Blossom enrite is more of a real calcium problem, but high yields, less fruit loss with this particular variety. So you may want to try it. It's from what I've read, it's got pretty good flavor. So just want to cover a few peppers here while we've got a little bit of time. But peppers, most people don't think of them vitamin C content, but one yellow pepper actually produces about 180% of your daily requirement of vitamin C. It's actually higher than many other things that we think about, even oranges and kiwis and cantaloupes and mangoes and strawberries. So a lot of good nutrients in peppers. So they're just really packed with vitamin C and antioxidants. A very good thing to incorporate in your diet. History of pepper really is from Mexico, where it was later imported to Spain and then spread all throughout Europe and Asia, and then back to the continental United States. Lady Bells, very popular. The nice thing about them is in a little 65 to 70 days, you can get peppers on the vine. There's a lot of different Lady Bell varieties out there, colors from red to brown to yellow to you name it. I mean, you can get them. There's one called Carnival that actually produces 3 to 4 different colors within the same seed packet. Lunchbox, same thing, where you've got these beautiful sweet peppers that can be used for snacking. Very abundant in terms of yield. A really good, actually, I think we have this plant this year that we're offering 55 days to maturity, and just a great little pepper, especially if you're going to be growing peppers inside of containers. This is a great one because of the smaller plant itself. My favorite pepper, I think, of all of these sweet peppers is called the Yummy. We've had this thing at our farm for years, and I just can't believe the yield of this thing and how sweet this pepper is. Just unbelievable. When we had it in the field a couple of years, and I looked out in the field, and it was just a sea of orange. That's how many peppers that these plants produced. If you have the right conditions in the soil, the right amount of fertilizer and water, these things just produce a ton of peppers, and they are absolutely, they're like eating candy. They're just unbelievably good snacks. Have you tried those, Ray?
Yes, I believe, I haven't grown them, but I believe I bought them in those little pepper snack packs they have from Florida. So
in as little as 44 days, you can get peppers. So you can grow them in containers. They do really well in 3 to 5 gallon containers. Teppan peppers are a hot type of pepper. Birds love these things, but they take a long time to produce. But they have Scoville units or Scoville heat units up to 50 to 100,000. So you got to be careful with these guys.
Super hot.
But birds will go after them. And then the Scoville system just describes how hot each one of these peppers gets. So, you know, the higher the Scoville unit, we're going to talk about this, you know, pure capsaicin is about 15,000 to 16,000. This pepper spray that people use is about 5 million, or 16 million, I should say, is pure capsaicin. Carolina Reaper is about 2 million. The different Buchalacas is another one that's pretty hot. That's about 800,000 to 1 million Scoville heat units. And you see as you go down, the Thai, it's only 50,000 to 100,000. Cayenne, down to jalapenos, which are about 2,500 to 8,000 Scoville units. And then the poblanos and the padrones, and Ray's going to talk about the padrones in a minute. But there's a lot of peppers out there, and of course the bell pepper is our standard 0 because it doesn't have the capsaicin levels in it, so extremely low level. But these other peppers do have higher capsaicin levels. Ghost pepper is one of the hotter ones, excess of 1 million Scoville units. So you got to be extremely careful with these. You don't want to touch your eyes or touch any other part of your body. I had a relative one time go out to help my uncle, and he didn't realize that he was picking hot peppers, and he came back and he said his whole body was on fire, and that's because he was out in the garden picking these, and then he went to rub his eye, and boy, his eyes were burning for quite a bit. So he should have talked to somebody before he went out into the garden and just started picking hot peppers. Have you ever tried these, Ray?
No, I like hot peppers, but they're even a little, one of my son's friends grows them and has given them to me, but they were a little bit much even for me.
So peppers like the Tam jalapeno, they're a little bit more mild, you know, in about 80 days. You'll see a little pepper starting to, or moderate-sized peppers that you'll actually be able to start to harvest. And people eat them fresh, they eat them cooked, but they're a little bit milder than some of the other jalapenos that are out there. So if you can't stand the heat, then get out of the kitchen or at least get one of those type of peppers. And here's another one, short season jalapeno M, 4,000 Scoville units, shorter season pepper, a little 70 to 73 days. You're going to get a pepper on there, and it's not going to be quite as hot as some of the other jalapenos. There's a pepper that looks just like the jalapenos. It's called Fold You, 65 days. You're going to get these peppers. You're going to get a lot of peppers on these plants, but they don't have the heat in them. They're just like eating a bell pepper. They're Peppadew peppers. Have you ever heard of those, Ray?
Yes, I've had them. There was a farmer in Monmouth County, I believe. He was growing them and processing them. I can't remember that guy's name, but yeah, I've eaten them.
Pretty good. A lot of times they use them for pickling, also known as picante pepper, and kind of resembles, it has a little bit of a look of a tomato on it too. Low Scoville units, only 1,100 to 1,200 Scoville units. So it's similar to the poblano peppers that we're going to talk about in a minute. And here they are. These are the beloved poblano Mexican peppers, dark green to brown. they are very mild. They're only about 1,000 to 2,000 Scoville heat units. So if you're looking for peppers with just a little bit of heat that you can use in many Mexican dishes, this would be the pepper for you. And there's many different varieties out there of the poblanos. It's also good stuffed with cheese as well, which can even calm it down more. And then we have one of Ray's favorite. And Ray, you can tell us a story about the padrones.
Sure. Sort of the national pepper of Spain, okay? My wife and I are big hikers. You know, we hike around here. We hike internationally. We hiked in Spain 4 or 5 times. But first time we were there on the Camino route, we did like 120 miles hiking through the mountains and end up in a little town called Padrón. So we love to eat locally when we go to these things, right? So we sit down in a little cafe, have some wine, and we have Padrón peppers. And you get them as an appetizer, as you see in that bowl. And they call them Spanish Russian roulette because when the peppers are between an inch and a half, they're very mild, very pleasant. And then about every 20th one, your hair will stand up. So it was kind of funny in the restaurant watching people eating these. And all of a sudden you hear somebody go, oh my God, you know, like in, you know, almost in pain, you know. But this is how good they were. The first time we had them, we ordered a bowl, like there were 4 of us. Then we said, you know, they were good. Let's have another one. And we ordered a 3rd bowl. So we ate 3 bowls of them as an appetizer. I had a trial the last year I worked, an extension, quite a large trial that we grew, ended up 2,000 or 3,000 pounds, which were ended up given to Farmers Against Hunger to the soup kitchens. But yeah, Spain, the pepper of Spain is great. And also, now that Bill mentioned earlier onto the subject of wine, if you love wine, Spain's the country to go to. Most of the wines we drank were €1 a bottle, $1.12. So you can't, and it was good. So go ahead, Bill. Yeah.
When I had these peppers that you had tried up at our place, I thought they were amazing. It was the way you cook them, but you're absolutely right because you would eat one and it would be fine. It wouldn't, you know, be that hot. Then you get, you know, like the 3rd or 4th one that I have, all of a sudden it really hit me.
Yeah.
Because I think they range, like they can range 4 times as hot just by the maturity of the pepper.
They're good.
You cook them, and also
I have them this year. I've grown them the last 6 years.
Now, do you serve, when you had these in Spain, did they serve them with cheese, or how did they?
No, exactly like it's in that picture. Sea salt and olive oil, and like charred is what they are. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm going to get some of these guys because I love the ones that you made last time. I just thought those things were amazing when you cooked them right.
Yep.
I don't think I ever tasted a hot pepper that I like so much as these guys. Here's another one that's just like it, Ray, that you could try.
Yeah, I've had these and grown them too, yeah.
Yeah, did you like them?
Yeah, they're good, and if you don't like the element of the 20th pepper being hot, these are the way to go because none of them are hot. You know,
yeah, these are pretty mild from what I have seen. I haven't grown them yet, but I do have them in the greenhouse right now.
Yep, they're good.
But, yeah, 60 days, you got peppers, a little bit longer if you want them red. But, you know, you can cook them just like the padrones because they have that thin outer skin on them. And I think people usually cook them, they cook them and they kind of sizzle the outside of the skin, and that's really what gives it the flavor with the olive oil. So it's a really good pepper to try. Yeah, so the Mellow Star is one of them that's an F1 that's really good. You might want to try that one. I don't know why we're not getting to the next slide. Oh, okay. For some reason, it kind of went too large here. I don't know how to make that any different. But I just wanted to let people know that if you want to find Jersey Fresh produce, you can just go on the web to findjerseyfresh.com. We're wrapping it up here pretty soon. But before we go, Dave is going to send out, Dave, if you're there, if you could send out that survey to everybody right now so that they could fill that out. You're going to see a survey appear. And please take a moment, please, to fill that out because we'd love to have your feedback if you'd like us to continue these seminars. So if you visit the Jersey Fresh website you see here, findjerseyfresh.com, They update it all the time. They have listings of direct markets and pick your own and CSAs. So you can just go on there and find the nearest markets near you. And I think it's really important to support our local farmers, especially in a year like this one, because the farmers are doing everything they possibly can to maintain a high level of safety at their farms, to make sure that the produce that you're getting is healthy, it's clean, it's the best product you're going to get anywhere when you buy directly from the farmer. So this is the best way to find those locations out there, just to jump on some of our websites. You can also go to visitnjfarms.org, which is another great location, and you can put, there's a lot of different parameters for whether a farm has apples or Christmas trees or direct markets or CSAs, and it'll show farms all throughout the state. And then you can link to those farms and find out a lot more great information about those farms from that site. So make sure you get a chance to visit that. But please fill out that survey for us on the right, because that's really important for us to keep continuing to do this if you fill out our surveys. Next week, we'd love to have you back, because our Master Gardener Coordinator and one of our other colleagues and friends is to be joining us for creating a pollinator's paradise in your yard. Some beautiful shots from the field of plants that are just pretty amazing to grow in your yard. Some natives plants, of course, and we try to promote natives as much as possible. Also, I want to point you to the past episodes of the program can be viewed here at tinyurl.com/rcevids. And we have some really good fact sheets that go over the information that we talk about on our Middlesex County website. So I really would like you to visit our Middlesex County website at tinyurl.com/Middlesex County Grows. And there, Dave has graciously, along with our other colleagues at the county, posted some of the links to the videos and the fact sheets. And you can also register for our program for next week there. And you can get a lot of really good information and link back to some informational sheets.
Before we end, could you answer a question or two yet?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
There's one on, they have questions about pruning tomatoes.
Okay.
There is a fact sheet on that, right?
Yes, we do have a fact sheet on pruning tomatoes. The thing with tomatoes is just don't over prune them. Typically what we'll do is we'll start from the bottom as we're moving up. And if there is a flower cluster, usually the one sucker right before the flower cluster I tend not to prune, because if you prune that back too early, it'll cut back on your overall production of that plant. And you want to limit, if you're going to have more than one vine coming up, if you have them in a staked culture, or if you have them in anything where you're actually containing them, you want to just maybe have 2 liters, and that's about it. And you wouldn't want more than that. And you want to make sure you support those with string or inside of a cage. And each tomato is pruned a little bit different. Some tomatoes you don't have to prune quite as aggressively because they're determinate varieties. The indeterminate varieties that keep growing, you're going to have to prune those, otherwise they're just going to completely get out of control. Ray, did you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. If you don't prune them at all, they're going to fall over, and you just end up with a massive bush, so they have to be pruned at least somewhat, generally. That's what I find.
Also, we answer a lot of questions every Wednesday. Angela, do you want to talk about that? Is Angela there?
We have our Helpline Live webinars every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. If you have a question, preferably we'd like for you to email mastergardeners@co.middlesex.nj.us. You can see the email address at the bottom in the subject line. Write live your question, and if you have any pictures, that would be really helpful. We can show these pictures to everyone that's viewing the presentation, and we can discuss how to address your garden issues. So next week we'll be talking about native plants, growing pollinator's paradise in your backyard, so, or front yard, depending on your restrictions. Yeah, we're going to be talking about native plants that will attract beneficial insects and wildlife to your garden, and how that could help your vegetable garden as well as the wildlife in your area.
I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today. And make sure, if you can, drop us a line, even at the Master Gardener website, to let us know if you're enjoying it and you want us to continue. If there's other topics you would like to see in the next month or two, let us know about that too. We're going to keep going as long as we can and keep sending out good information to you. Take care, everybody, and have a safe week. And we hope to see you back here again next week.